For Want of a Meal by MagerBlutooth. Warning! The events, actions and antics depicted in this book are performed by fictional characters in a controlled narrative setting. Under no circumstances should anyone attempt to replicate, imitate, or recreate any of the behaviours or scenarios described. Doing so could result in serious injury, harm, or unintended consequences. Louise Thrushwood was a modest, motherly mouse that lived within the walls of a quiet two-storey home. If anything could be considered loud in her home, it would be the bellies of her grandchildren, and as the family's food provider, it was her duty to keep them quiet. Each morning, before the sunrise, she would make her way to the house's kitchen to gather crumbs, drippings, and other scraps that had been carelessly left behind by the house's larger residents. This was the Thrushwood way, to take only what was left behind while no one was around to care. The most reward with the smallest risk. It allowed her and her family to live in the house without its residents being any the wiser, and she wouldn't hear any talk of her family being a bunch of thieves. As her father always used to tell her, it's not stealing if no one wants it. Louise had never encountered any of the house's giants, but she knew that they were fond of midnight snacking and less fond of cleaning up after themselves. As a result, most of what Louise scavenged consisted of various cheeses, crackers, and cookies, which made up the majority of her family's diet. She would have liked if the housemasters snacked on some more fruits and veggies now and again, but scavengers couldn't be choosers. Wielding her father's sword, which had grown far too dull for combat, she would poke each crumb, inspect it, and place it in her basket if it passed her inspection. That morning, she happened upon something truly special in the midst of rounding up a scattering of cookie crumbs. One of the crumbs in question happened to contain a fully intact chocolate chip, the food of the gods. After sniffing it to confirm it wasn't just a raisin, she held it up to gaze at its shine in the sunlight. She so badly wanted to taste it. It had been months since anyone in her family had even smelled chocolate. But she had to restrain herself. Her father had always warned her about snacking while scavenging. One thoughtless bite could quickly lead to an empty basket, and Louise couldn't bear the thought of her family going hungry because of her. After depositing the final crumb into her basket, Louise sheathed her sword and immediately headed for home. She didn't want to risk sticking around once the housemasters woke up. The less time she spent outside her mouse hole, the better. The Thrushwood home was already full of life by the time Louise returned. The triplets were playing around on the couch. Sophia was hard at work putting her ribbons on everything, and Elizabeth was skulking in the corner practicing her evil stare. Louise's grandkids all threw out a warm welcome upon their grandmother's arrival, though Louise's own kids were a little preoccupied. Adam and Abigail were still sleeping like a rock and a log, respectively, acting as additional props for Sophia's decorations. Meanwhile, Morgan was already doing the prep work for breakfast. She was never one to take it easy. Louise wanted to keep the little surprise that she had found that morning a secret, especially from Morgan. It was difficult enough to convince her to feed her kids the cookie crumbs she scavenged, but Louise understood. It was Morgan's job as the mother to be a stick in the mud. But at the same time, Louise felt it was her duty as the grandmother to spoil her grandkids rotten. As long as she was the scavenger in the house, she'd make sure they got a little sugar in their diet. Louise did wonder how much longer that would be, though. More and more, Morgan had been hinting that Louise consider retiring her role as the family scavenger. Louise was already in her mid-50s, and her vision wasn't exactly as sharp as it used to be. Louise could see her point, but every time she thought about hanging up her cape, she'd remember the smiling faces of her little ones every morning she brought in a basket of goodies. It made her feel like she was doing her part, like she was a precious member of the family that couldn't be forgotten like her father was. She had a role to play, and she was the best to play it. Morgan, Adam, and Abigail had only scavenged a handful of times, and they still had a long way to go. Morgan was too cautious, and she couldn't find enough crumbs to fill her basket. Adam had a tendency to snack on the job, and Abby was too easily distracted by the wonders of the larger house. Louise wanted to see them improve, but she wasn't ready to let go of her title just yet. She knew that she had many more adventures left in her. As lively as the Thrushwood household could become, nothing turned it on quite like mealtime. No Thrushwood nose could resist the siren song of the dinner table, especially during breakfast when the crumbs were at their freshest. Even the most tasteless of saltines burst with flavour when placed on a plate with a sprinkle of grandmotherly love. Unlike the patrons of the larger house, they would not leave one crumb behind. Dropped food would be eaten off the floor without hesitation. To do otherwise would be hypocritical. Louise had melted down the chocolate chip to use as a topping to the cheese, cracker and cookie crumbs she'd scavenged that morning. She'd played the role of the chocolate fairy, sprinkling a little touch of heaven into each of their plates. When it came to Morgan's kids, however, it didn't take much in the tank to get their engines running. Davy grabbed his ball from the living room to toss around. Sophia started biting her food face first like a wild animal, and Abigail suddenly found it difficult to resist teasing her twin brother. They were almost as energetic after eating it as they were just to see it. Even picky little Elizabeth had a chance of joining the clean plate club with chocolate on the table. Louise couldn't begin to measure her joy at seeing the table so alive. Morgan, on the other hand, was on full damage control, striving to quell the storm that was brewing as a result of combining her kids and sugar. She'd never understand why her mother enjoyed causing such chaos. As she attempted to wipe the chocolate off a jittering Sophia's face, Davy threw his ball a little too hard, knocking off Douglas's glasses and flying back into the living room. Dirk was naturally upset with this manoeuvre, as it was actually his ball, and he didn't like the looks of where it was flying. Morgan chastised Davy for playing around at the dinner table, failing to notice just where that ball was heading. The ball had rolled all the way from the dining room table, across the living room, and out toward the front door. Were the door shut, it would have harmlessly bounced off it. However, in the excitement of preparing her chocolate topping, Louise had forgotten to close the door behind her. Thus there was nothing to stop the ball from rolling through the open door and into the untamed wilderness of the larger house. If there was one rule in the Thrushwood house, it was to never leave the safety of the mouse hole after sunrise for any reason. Under Morgan's rules, even looking outside of the mouse hole was grounds for a spanking. It was a rule for the adults as well as the children, though for the adults it was more of a strong suggestion. There was no telling what awaited them out there once the rest of the house was awake, and none of them were too keen on finding out. Even so, Dirk and Davy only had the one ball, and it wasn't as though there was a store around for them to buy another. If the larger residents found the ball and took it away, it would be gone forever. Louise volunteered to retrieve it, insisting there was no cause for concern. Their mouse hole had intentionally been dug out far away from any of the large furniture that could conceal predators, and the ball hadn't rolled too far out anyway. Louise was experienced enough to know what she could and couldn't get away with. She hung up her apron and strolled out to retrieve it with a casual, "Be right back," not even bothering to grab her sword or cape. Morgan was less optimistic about the idea. She wanted to tell her mother to stop, but Sophia, still high on her sugar rush, cut her off with the unrelenting demand to be read The Legend of Ice Cream again. In truth, Morgan didn't want her boys to lose their favourite toy either. She was just very partial to her grandfather's mantra of no unnecessary risks. At the very least, she wished her mother would put her cape on if she was going outside. She'd die of embarrassment if another mouse family saw her mother like that. Louise's plan of attack was simple. Walk outside, pick up the ball, run back inside. As long as nothing jumped out at her and pinned her to the wall, she was sure that there would be no issues. But there was something else, something far more dangerous lurking in the outside world to prey on her. Not a predator, not a monster, but a smell. A smell that surpassed any she had ever experienced. The many years of scavenging had strengthened Louise with a fair amount of willpower. When out on the prowl for crumbs or serving her kids at the dinner table, she was pretty good at keeping her tongue in her mouth. But when it came to real food, the sort that was actually made to be eaten by someone, she was exposed for the glutton she truly was. Her nose had a mind of its own. At that moment, Finding the source of the smell was all that mattered. All other thoughts were purged from her mind. She couldn't be shocked out of her mental state if her tail was shoved directly into an electrical socket. She had to know what it was. Following the smell with pinpoint accuracy, she made her way across the living room to the nearby door. The scent was coming straight through the vent that passed right across into the opposite room. In other words, it was coming from the kitchen. She couldn't map the scent to any food item she could name. Was it sour or sweet? Salty or spicy? She didn't know. But she had to know. The smell was too good to be true. She pushed her head through the large flap at the base of the door to see what mysteries awaited her. Louise was no stranger when it came to cats. She had seen lazy cats, mean cats, dumb cats, snooty cats, and even dog-like cats. Her strongest memory was at the old barn where she and her father once lived. There was one scrawny orange barn cat tasked to protect the silo from vermin. He was a pitiful creature, really, frightened off by a simple poke to the hindquarters with her father's sword. Over time, Louise's father managed to train him to fetch the leftovers from the farmer's table and save him the trouble of scavenging. Over time, Louise saw the cat as a friendly companion, like a big teddy bear that brought her food. The creature on the other side of that door flap, though, was no teddy bear. Its appearance was so striking that it knocked Louise out of her trance. The beast was covered from head to tail in a forest of thick fur. Much of the forest was coated in a bright brown, with white markings lighting up its cheeks, feet, belly, and tail tip. The white markings on its feet and tail were preceded by heavy patches of dark brown, resembling the broken shackles of an escaped prison convict. That same dark shade of brown formed long, jagged stripes that descended down her back and forehead, like scars obtained in the process of escaping said prison. Most intimidating of all, her side boasted a unique and unusual marking of the same dark colour in the shape of a foreboding skull. As the cat turned around, Louise could see the same marking miraculously adorn both sides, making the creature equally intimidating no matter which way it was facing. The cat's fur was certainly off-putting, but what really struck Louise was how massive the beast was in size. While the vast amount of fluff obscured the creature's true size, this was definitely one fat cat. It made her old barn cat friend look like a large rat by comparison. Louise couldn't believe she had been living in the same house as something so enormous without knowing about it. In hindsight, she was feeling awfully glad that her family avoided the house's larger patrons. After taking in the sights, Louise's thoughts turned back to the smell. The cat was rather unceremoniously lapping up a bowl of milk on the kitchen floor. It was a familiar sight for Louise. The barn cat did it all the time. But where was that smell coming from? The aroma certainly wasn't coming from mere milk, and there didn't seem to be anyone else in the kitchen. But Louise's nose didn't lie. This was definitely the room it was coming from. Just then, Louise heard a loud ding. She instinctively ducked down, thinking the cat had noticed her or Morgan had come to drag her home. In actuality, it averted the cat's attention even further away from Louise. Louise watched intently as the cat made its way over to one of the large kitchen boxes she had always found too risky to mess with during her scavenging. After responding to the ding, the cat returned to its milk bowl, and Louise became privy to the answers of two of her questions. Where was the smell coming from? And how was this cat so fat? It seemed a little strange to see a cat with a milk bowl without a food bowl to go with it. The cat returned not with one food bowl, but with 5. Each one contained a gloriously fattening dish beyond anything Louise's taste buds had encountered. If she couldn't smell it herself, she'd never believe it. Soft swirl ice cream sandwiched between 2 donuts, boiled shrimp coated in chocolate, a burrito stuffed with cheese fries and layered with honey, and one of the bowls looked to just contain a jar of mayonnaise with an ice cream cone stuck to its lid by way of caramel. The cat certainly had peculiar tastes, but Louise wasn't one to talk. Each bowl sent more and more saliva pouring out of her mouth until she finally caught herself and scooped her tongue off the floor. She knew she had to resist her burning desire to leap into the nearest bowl and join the cat in its feeding frenzy, but the food wasn't helping her sense of duty. The bright blue bowl closest to Louise had a ham, cheese, and marshmallow sandwich in it that was practically begging her to eat it. The raw fish in between the two bread slices was practically looking at her. She could hear it calling her name. Just one bite. Morgan and the cat will never know. Louise couldn't do it. She had to turn away. If the twin skulls on the cat's sides were good for anything, it was dissuading Louise from risking getting up close and personal with them. The last thing Louise wanted for was this creature to find out there were mice in the house. Wrestling herself free of the tantalizing odours and colours, Louise pulled her head back through the door and steeled herself to return home. The image of the cat eating was burned into her mind as she headed back, including one little detail that stood out to her. Louise had encountered those bowls before in an empty state. Each one was emblazoned with a single word must have identified its owner. Ambrosia. Louise's foray into the unknown had not gone unnoticed. While she had felt helpless to do anything as her mother brazenly wandered beyond any conceivable realm of safety, Morgan was all too eager to read her mother the riot act upon her return. Slamming the door to their home shut and locking it tightly, Morgan shoved her mother back into the dining room. Louise's feet dragged along the dirt floor in apprehension. Louise didn't make any excuses. She knew what she did was wrong. She knew Morgan's anger was justified. She had let her love of food take over and put an unnecessary risk on the family's head. This was not the Thrushwood way. What would her father think if he were here to see this? Louise didn't dare mention the sights she had seen, as she knew even hinting there was a cat in the house would send Morgan to the ceiling. She could still remember all the times Morgan would crawl into her bed at night, crying that she saw a cat tail outside her window. They had lived in a hollow log back then, and it took forever to convince Morgan that it was just a cat tail. But this time the cat tail was very real, and like the rest of the cat, it was bigger and fatter than even Louise had ever seen. Louise wasn't about to tell Morgan how close she had come to revealing herself to it, though it didn't seem like she could make things much worse for herself. Morgan insisted that if Louise was going to act like a child, then she would be treated like one. From that day forward, Louise was to follow all of the same rules as Morgan's children. No leaving the mouse hole or even looking outside of it under any circumstances. Naturally, this meant her scavenging days were officially over. Louise wanted to protest, but she had nothing to counter with. What she had done was reckless. What if she encountered such a delicious smell while scavenging? Would she be able to control herself then? It wasn't as though Morgan, Adam, and Abigail couldn't perform the job. It would probably be better in the long run for them to start getting that experience. Louise just wished her time didn't have to end so abruptly. Louise meekly accepted her daughter's punishment in silence. Though her sadness was overtaking her, it lessened as she handed Dirk his ball, watching the smile on his face as he scampered off to play with it. She wanted to keep feeling it, that feeling of providing for her family, that feeling of being useful. Whether she was a scavenger or not, she wanted to keep that feeling alive, even if she had to fight off 100 cats to make it happen. The following morning, Louise rose before the roosters crow to carry out her scavenger duties as normal, only realizing when she got to the front door that it was her first day of forced retirement. Morgan had modified the sign on the front door to say no children or old ladies beyond this point. Louise got the message, but she felt a bit slighted. She wasn't an old lady yet, so clearly this sign didn't apply to her. She looked back to confirm her kids were still snugly tucked in bed. Then she impishly pushed open the door and stuck one foot out, as if to stick a finger in the sign's eye. As she did, she suddenly felt glad that her kids had overslept. The gigantic cat that Louise had encountered the day before was suddenly before her, napping in the centre of the living room right next to the kitchen door. What was the beast doing here? Why now of all times? Louise had never encountered it before yesterday. Had it detected her? Had Louise given away that there were mice in the living room? Was it her drool? While all of these questions buzzed through her mind, they were all eclipsed by the second unusually large object in the room. A well-sized slice of cake at least 3 times as big as Louise's whole body. It was resting on a plate, uneaten, right in front of the snoozing cat. Louise didn't know what to make of such a sight. Did the cat originally have the entire cake and fall asleep after eating all but one slice? Did someone set the cake down as a treat for the cat after it woke up? Was this cat perhaps so pampered that it coughed up cake slices instead of hairballs? In any case, it was clear that this cake was off limits. She knew her father's words all too well. Scavengers only took what was unwanted. Anything more was stealing. It didn't matter how much her tongue was screaming for satisfaction. It didn't matter how much it looked like that cat could sleep through construction work in a thunderstorm. It didn't matter how much untold joy her grandkids would experience receiving even a single lick of that frosting. There was simply no way she could run out and take a piece of that cake, even if it was within the safety zone. It was unthinkable. Yep, completely out of the question. Before Louise knew it, she was standing beside the cake, her heart pounding from her chest so loudly she was afraid it would wake the cat. She couldn't remember how she got there, or even when she put on her cape. Her nose had staged a mutiny and had taken control of her feet. Not that she realized such a thing at the time. It was too rational for her state of mind. Her mind was on the cake, the delicious, all-important cake. Her eyes were practically turning pink to match its glossy glow as she shambled towards it like a zombie. How much could she take? Was it better to go for the front or the back? Could she dare make 2 trips? Should she use her cheeks like a squirrel to carry as much as possible? Would it still be edible if she did? All of these fleeting thoughts eventually gave way to one word. Strawberry. Without skipping a beat, she thoughtlessly clambered onto the cake slice and seized the crown jewel resting on top of it, twirled around and sprinted back to safety, out of the snoozing behemoth's long reach. At least that's how it went in her head. In reality, her legs had become nothing more than wheels spinning in the mud. They were moving quickly, but her body wasn't going, and there was a suspiciously heavy weight now resting on her tail that even her cake-addled brain couldn't ignore. Louise suddenly understood the feeling her daughter had felt when fearfully climbing into her parents' covers all those years ago. With thoughts of frosting and happiness forcefully ejected from her mind, all now she could dream about was the thought of her dad petting her head and comforting her with the revelation that it was only a cattail. By the time the cat released its vice grip on Louise's tail, the mouse was too paralyzed by fear to even consider running. With much of her mental facilities restricted, Louise could only stare up at the controller of her fate. The massive beast glared down at her with those watchful green eyes, shining bright enough to illuminate a dark room. As the two stared motionlessly at one another, a desperate thought of hope managed to escape the tangled maze of Louise's mind. It was true this cat was beyond intimidating in appearance, but Louise wasn't entirely sure what kind of personality it had. She knew it had an appetite that could rival even her own, but beyond that she had no clue what category this creature fell under. Perhaps at heart it was no different than the timid barn cat she and her dad had befriended all those years ago. Finding the strength to speak, Louise called out the name she had seen written on those food bowls. Ambrosia. Based on the way the cat's ears pricked up, Louise was convinced that she had guessed its name correctly. It gave her the courage to continue. She began by apologising to the cat for disturbing its sleep and taking its strawberry. She set the strawberry down as a peace offering, insisting that the cat would never see hide nor hair of her again if it let her go. She attempted to butter the cat up, insisting that a cat so big surely had a big heart to match. She was reasonably certain it was a lady cat, so she added that a lovely lady like herself surely didn't have the stomach for violence. She gauged the cat's face for a reaction. Louise wasn't certain, but she thought it was smiling, so she smiled back as best she could, putting all of the manners her dad had taught her to use. Was she getting through to it? Had she said something wrong? Could the cat understand her words? She wasn't ashamed to become a total kiss-up, but she wasn't certain what traits the cat would even want to be praised for. Was it proud of its fluffiness? Its appetite? Its fur markings? Louise didn't know what to praise, but she knew she had to pick something. In the end, she blurted out that she'd never seen such a fat cat before, and she instantly felt the colour seep out of her pores. Why had she said that? It had sounded much better in her head. But who would ever take that as a compliment? Accepting that she had possibly sealed her fate, Louise put on her cutest, most innocent face, and then she waited. Waited to see how the cat would respond. Back when Louise lived in the barn with her dad, she would often play fetch with the barn cat. She'd tie up some hay into a ball and toss it out the window, watching with joy and amusement as the cat would clumsily fumble over itself to clamber out the window and retrieve it, only to bring it back with an ignorant grin on its face, hungry for more. Louise never understood what made that cat so eager to chase around a simple ball of hay, so she was surprised to see Ambrosia present her with a similar toy, a ball made entirely of yarn instead of hay. Louise got closer to inspect the yarn, checking to see if there was anything special about it. After finding nothing spectacular, Louise offered to play fetch, feeling a little nostalgic at the prospect. Ambrosia simply nudged the yarn closer, as if suggesting Louise to take a closer look. Curious, Louise peered into the tangled maze of yarn. As she stared, she felt her mind slipping away into the crisscrossing red lines. She started appreciating it like a work of art, the lines flowing in random yet orderly methods and converged into one collective sphere. Was this what Ambrosia wanted to show her? Was this cat a lover of the arts? Louise was beginning to see the appeal. Before Louise could get too impressed, she suddenly realized that it wasn't just her mind that was lost in the bright red yarn. It was her body, too. As she was admiring the look of the yarn ball, something had shoved her inside from behind. She scrambled to free herself, but she only ended up hopelessly entangled, loosely enough that she could squirm, but firmly enough that she couldn't squirm free. She cried out Ambrosia's name for assistance, but by that point the ride had already started. Up and down Louise was thrown, carelessly and playfully. The yarn ball would fall onto the cat's paws, getting kicked around before being launched high into the air once more. Were Louise 20 years younger, the experience may have been exhilarating. But right there, in that moment, it was all she could do to keep her heart from leaping out her mouth and screaming. Was this her punishment? Was she getting her just desserts for stealing the strawberry? She wasn't used to such a thing. Her dad had been one to spare the rod when Louise acted up. She wondered if her gluttonous mannerisms would be as much of an issue if she had someone like Ambrosia as a mum. Perhaps this would be good for her in the long run. While she couldn't stop herself from squeaking in terror, Louise decided to suck it up and accept the cat's punishment. After all, if she could earn the cat's forgiveness, it was worth a little mortal terror. Despite Louise's best efforts, it seemed her mortal terror was slated to last a little longer. After Ambrosia finally tired of the yarn ball, the cat suddenly dropped it and walked off, as if its mind was suddenly wiped of Louise's existence. Louise thought it was a good sign, as if the prison guard had just thoughtlessly dropped the keys to her cell in front of her. However, she still couldn't quite squirm free of the yarn. She spent a few minutes struggling, using her teeth to gnaw through the tasteless licorice. But just as she was about to find an opening, a loud and mysterious wind from above suddenly ripped her from her bonds and took gravity as payment. Louise was sucked into a dark plastic tube. There was hardly an inch of room to move around. She had slept in sewer pipes that were more spacious. But before she could make heads or tails of her predicament, the mysterious gust of wind roared again, this time spitting her out of the tube and into the open air once again. The air just kept blasting out at her, and Louise was left dangling in place, too small to fall and too heavy to float. It was then that Louise realized she was being assaulted by some kind of air-controlling device. And at her backside was Ambrosia, manning the switch to the machine. Louise understood clearly. This was the second phase of her punishment. Every few seconds, Ambrosia would flick the switch back and forth, changing the direction of the wind to pull Louise in and out of the tube. Looking at Ambrosia's face, Louise could see a sinister grin that only seemed to grow the more Louise squeaked. Was this more than just an act of justice? Was this payback for the fat cat comment? Thinking about it, Louise herself had once set a pitfall trap for an ex-lover that called her a fat rat, and her expression at the time wasn't too different than Ambrosia's was now. Perhaps it would be hypocritical to hold this cat in contempt for getting enjoyment out of this. With that in mind, Louise decided to let the cat have her catharsis. Though her sides started to chafe from sliding in and out of the tube so much, at least she could feel good that she wasn't yet too fat to fit inside. Louise couldn't fathom how much longer this punishment would go on. After Ambrosia tired of the wind machine, Louise was taken into the next room over. It wasn't the kitchen, so Louise had never encountered it before. Much of it was too dark to see, but Louise could make out the desk that hosted a series of black boxes on it, with one of the black boxes off to the side on the floor. Ambrosia grabbed a small round device that was resting on a thin rectangular cushion and tossed it aside, placing Louise on the cushion in its place. Then the cat pressed a button on the lower box, and a blinding light shone from the upper one, accompanied by a fanfare of electronic instruments. Ambrosia sat down in the chair in front of the desk and put on a set of fancy-looking earmuffs with an attached stick that extended to Ambrosia's mouth. Louise wasn't sure what purpose the earmuffs served, as Ambrosia wasn't even wearing them on her ears. Nevertheless, the cat was fixated on the glowing box, while at the same time refusing to release her grip on Louise. In terms of punishment, it was far tamer than the yarn ball or the air machine. Ambrosia would slide Louise around the mat with erratic movements, occasionally pressing down on Louise's backside every few seconds. Louise couldn't understand how this movement translated to the shiny box, as Ambrosia seemed to be really happy with what was going on, hardly paying any mind to the mouse at all. Perhaps Louise was being used as a stress ball, while Ambrosia consulted the shiny box. Reaching into the desk, Ambrosia pulled out some junk food to snack on during her box game. The smell surprised Louise, as she had never imagined that food could be found in the house outside of the kitchen. She was especially surprised to see Ambrosia pull out a homemade ice cream float that was still projecting its coldness. Fridges go in kitchens, not dark mystery rooms. Did this cat have a second fridge just for playing box games? More importantly, Louise was desperately trying to figure out if she had managed to win the cat's favour yet. She was content to act as the stress ball or whatever if the cat would just sign a release on her detainment. Once she got used to it, the pressure from Ambrosia's paw was even a bit relaxing, like a deep tissue massage. She wanted to ask Ambrosia if they were square, but it didn't seem like quite the right time to ask. Whatever game Ambrosia was playing, she appeared to be winning. Louise's eyes still hadn't adjusted to the light after being removed from the box room, but she could tell from the colour of the wallpaper that she was in another new room. She wondered if she would ever see the living room or her beloved family again. Short of earning Ambrosia's forgiveness, Louise had been counting on the cat getting bored or running out of things for her to do, but each of the cat's cages just seemed to give way to another. After having her fill of snacks and box games, Ambrosia seemed to be in the mood for a nap. It made sense. Most of Louise's memories of cats involved them sleeping, or being drowsy enough to lull to sleep, a fact to which she attributed most of her family's survival. Even so, it seemed she wouldn't be getting out of this one quite so easily, as Ambrosia set a hairbrush in front of Louise before assuming the curled position of a sleepy kitty. She also refused to close her eyes until Louise began brushing her fur, reopening them each time Louise took a break. Louise calculated her options. Even if Ambrosia did nod off, Louise felt as though all of her goodwill would fly out the window if she was suddenly gone when Ambrosia woke up. And that was assuming she could even get away. What if she made a run for it before Ambrosia was fully asleep? There was no way she could outrun a cat at her age. Beyond that, where would she even go? She didn't even know what room she was in, which might have even been the reason the cat chose this room for nap time. Who knew what kind of crazy rooms this house was hiding? One wrong turn could take her right into the hall of mousetraps. She may as well have been trapped in a maze. Without some pungent cheese to guide her to the exit, her feet were glued in place. While her condition was disconcerting, there was something else eating away at her. Before settling down, Ambrosia had brought with her a bowl of buttered brownie bites from the box room to serve as one final snack before bed. Though the promise of escape was tempting, Louise could hardly focus with those puppies licking her nose. Like the strawberry cake that came before, the smell was heavenly, and this time they were tantalizingly close. One of them was even hanging out of its porcelain lodging, extending its reach towards Louise like a forbidden lover. Louise wanted to accept its embrace, to grant it a simple peck on the cheek. She might have gotten away with it had she been pampering one of the lazy cats from her childhood. Because of that fact, she underestimated Ambrosia's energy and greed. Louise never could have imagined just how watchful the cat's eyes were when it came to her food. Louise was practically humming her funeral march as Ambrosia carried her into the kitchen. She felt no different than when Morgan had caught her the previous morning before. Once again, she felt unable to make an excuse. She had fallen victim to her tongue twice in 2 days. The best she could hope for at this stage was a well-seasoned casket. After wedging Louise inside a salt shaker to keep her in place, Ambrosia grabbed a large loaf of bread from the pantry. The size of the bread astounded Louise, but it was quickly wiped from her mind as Ambrosia pulled open the fridge. As the faintest chill from the big icy box blew across her face, Louise's jaw fell open. She was starstruck. Her vision rapidly switched from blurry to picture-perfect as she ogled over every sacred treasure she could spot. All the meals she and Morgan could prepare if she got her paws on just one of them. Louise's mind buzzed with images of her family dipping all of their potato crumbs in ketchup, or sampling something as exotic as zucchini. Never mind all the meat that was in that fridge. Louise could recall the time her dad had managed to snag the two of them a leg of wild bird. The bird was awfully huffy about it, but even getting an earful of bird poop couldn't have ruined the magic of that experience. What a marvel it would be to share it with her grandkids. Louise couldn't even take notice of why Ambrosia opened the fridge or what she was rummaging around for. She was captivated by the sights and smells that were courting her eyes, nose, and tongue. All this time, this was the paradise she had blinded herself to by adhering to her father's no-risk principles. She felt as if a blindfold had been pulled from her eyes. To experience something such as this, how could she not take the risk? If only she had realized sooner, she and her family would have known full bellies, if only for a little while. Instead, she was filled with regret and shame. Regret that none of this food would ever reach her own lips or the lips of her family. And shame that her final moments would involve her spitting on her father's legacy by abandoning his principles in both body and spirit. All she could hope for was that his eyes still weren't good enough to see her as he watched from on high. Was this refrigerator the science lab where Ambrosia concocted her ridiculous food combinations? The cauldron that summoned her magical artifacts? It had to be. There was no mistaking it. Louise vowed that if she somehow survived Ambrosia's punishment, she would bring at least a crumb from that fridge back home, even if she were reduced to her head and had to store it in her cheeks. No matter how long the moment seemed to last, it was still just a moment. Eventually the fridge shut, and Ambrosia returned with the tools of her trade. Louise recognized the items she was holding immediately. Sandwich fixings. She gulped, for what she figured would be the last time, as Ambrosia put on her chef's hat and began slicing the bread in two. Ambrosia pulled Louise from her salt shaker prison and removed her cape and glasses, presumably to increase her flavor profile. Then Louise was placed between two fluffy buns of the bread variety. Once the mouse was in place, there were no rules for what else was placed to act as her neighbours. Lettuce, tomato, mayonnaise, peanut butter, raw fish, whipped cream, and a slice of pizza for texture. It was a signature Ambrosia creation. Though Louise had been willing to accept her punishment, once she was inside the sandwich, her survival instincts took hold. She didn't want things to end like this. She wanted to see her family again. She wanted to eat tasty food. But now wasn't the time to think about snacking. Ignoring all of the delicious toppings that surrounded her, Louise scampered towards the end of the sandwich furthest from Ambrosia, hoping the cat's chomping was slowed by all the snacks she ate earlier. Ideally, with all the toppings the sandwich had, the cat wouldn't even notice she was missing. She poked her head out of the sandwich, squeaking in terror as she strained to pull her back half free as well. After finally freeing herself, she started to make a run for it, but paused when she didn't hear Ambrosia's massive footsteps chasing after her. As she looked back, she was further surprised by the fact that Ambrosia hadn't even taken a bite of her sandwich. She was instead holding her belly, her tongue flailing out of her mouth as she trilled in amusement at Louise's performance. Louise's face turned bright red. First in embarrassment, then in anger. She was beginning to suspect this cat was messing with her. With a pickle on her head and a chip on her shoulder, Louise was positively beside herself. Putting her in a sandwich and eating her was one thing, but being a big bully was inexcusable. Neither Louise nor her father would ever tolerate such behaviour. It riled Louise up more than anything. She could recall a time when Davy was something of a bully to his brothers, and she had felt compelled to set him straight even more than Morgan did. When it came to such things, she didn't care how big or intimidating Ambrosia looked. This cat needed to be taught some manners. After being taken back to the living room for Ambrosia's next game, Louise insisted on digging in her heels and calling Ambrosia out. Like a stern mother, Louise lectured Ambrosia about treating others with respect, as well as being grateful for the food she had. And like a rebellious teenage daughter, Ambrosia only stared back with a smirk, playfully chomping at a leftover cucumber from her sandwich, while she looked down on Louise as if onlooking a circus performance. It was clear that Louise's words weren't getting through Ambrosia's thick skull. Such a feat would take action, and Louise knew just the action to take. She would need to employ the strategy she had once used to get Davy on the straight and narrow. Standing tall despite her head pickle, Louise challenged Ambrosia to 3 events of her choosing. If Louise lost even one, Ambrosia could do as she wished with her. But if Louise won all 3, then Ambrosia would have to share some of the food from her fridge with Louise and her family. What a time for Morgan to finally wake up for scavenging duty. Morgan had no idea what her mother was thinking. She didn't even know where to begin. What was her mother doing outside the mouse hole? Why did she blatantly ignore her note on the door? Why didn't she have her sword? Why was she helping a four-legged killing machine set up an obstacle course? More importantly, why was the four-legged killing machine helping her do the same? Morgan had only met one cat before in her life, and she could still remember the hungry look in its eyes as it picked her up with its tail and licked her across the face for a taste. Lucky for her, that cat wasn't fond of the flavour, but this walking she-demon looked fit to scarf down the entire family as a morning snack. Had they really been living alongside such a monster? Morgan didn't understand why or how her mother had lost her mind, but she certainly wasn't about to step in and doom them both. Her mother was on her own. Even so, Morgan's curiosity compelled her to watch. Why had her mother challenged a cat to an obstacle course? And why had the cat agreed? After setting up the chalkboard to act as a scorekeeper, the first event was on. Though the stakes were high, Ambrosia was still only playing around, high-stepping beside Louise at a brisk pace while the mouse ran as fast as she could. Ambrosia intentionally knocked over every obstacle she came across. Whether it was intentional or sheer clumsiness, it didn't matter. The obstacles only served as the path to the finish line, and none of them incurred any penalties as long as they were passed. Louise didn't complain either. Her plan didn't come into play until the final obstacle. With the last set of obstacles before them, Morgan could barely watch. That cat had her mother dancing in its paw the entire race, and Louise could barely keep up. After Ambrosia cleared the last hurdle, all that remained was a pair of crawl tubes, one for each competitor. Louise was still nearing the top of her ladder, trying to climb her own final hurdle as Ambrosia slid into her crawl tube. Then, just as Ambrosia pulled her head out to squeeze through the tube and deliver the final blow, she suddenly stopped. Her backside wasn't following her. Cats were known for their ability to squeeze through narrow spaces, but such an ability had its limits. Louise knew this, and she knew in Ambrosia's case that limit was the size of her massive derriere. Though the cat had no problem squeezing herself into the tube, no amount of squirming was going to get her back out. Like a piping bag clogged with too much cookie dough, that cat wasn't going anywhere, much less crossing the finish line. The best she could do was helplessly roll from side to side, unable to move an inch forward. She had become one with the tube, and that meant Louise was free to clear her own tube and take first place in the first event. As a mouse, she fit through hers with ease. Were Louise a certain kind of mouse, she would have been tempted to let Ambrosia get used to her new way of life. But Louise always kept her promises, and she was insistent on completing the 3 challenges. She left right away to get the butter, instead of accepting vindication for calling Ambrosia a fat cat as her prize. Morgan wasn't too keen on the idea of releasing the cat from its big blue shackle, but she had to admit she was impressed her mother could show the creature up. With a face full of shame and a belly full of butter, Ambrosia's tail waggled in anticipation of the second event. Louise could tell she was no longer playing around, and given her performance in the obstacle course, Louise didn't blame her. Louise had planned for this, though, and was ready to announce the second event. Of the few cat toys Louise could name, there was one she could call her favourite, one that her father had once used to save her from a whole basket of kittens. The dot maker. Louise knew cats loved chasing around the red dot made by the dot maker, even cats that didn't like to run. That was why she knew Ambrosia had to have one, and it didn't take much probing for Ambrosia to draw it out of her toy box, which meant Louise had everything she needed for the event. Using the dot maker, Louise would try to keep the dot away from Ambrosia for 10 minutes. If Ambrosia caught it before time ran out, she would win. If Louise's dot could evade her for all that time, she would win. In order for the light to be caught, Ambrosia would need to hold it in her paws for at least 5 seconds. And to make sure Ambrosia was content with these conditions, Louise made sure to offer Ambrosia the option to refuse the challenge. That is, if it was too difficult for her. Naturally, Ambrosia would never refuse after such a statement. She indicated her acceptance by lowering into a pouncing position. Louise nodded and started the timer. Morgan was given a front row seat as a cat transformed into a frog before her very eyes. Having been drawn out of her mouse hole to watch more closely, it was all she could do to hold in her laughter. The cat was clumsily and determinedly leaping and flopping its way around the living room, desperately trying to catch a collection of light. As the cat's frustration increased, it began diving into the light head first, trying to catch it in its mouth. It paid little mind to what its face slammed into, whether it be floor, wall, or lamp. Morgan could commend the cat's resilience, though she started to wonder if it was actually just an oversized kitten. Even Sophia wouldn't fall for such a simple trick. Louise felt a little bad for deceiving Ambrosia. In truth, the real challenge was for Ambrosia to reject the challenge. Once Ambrosia failed that, it was already over for her. On the one hand, Louise hoped she could show Ambrosia how it felt to be deceived, but she also didn't want to deceive herself. She knew that a part of this was payback for Ambrosia's contemptible treatment of her earlier, as she couldn't stop smiling as Ambrosia got more and more flustered trying to catch the laser. After the timer went off, Ambrosia was left with empty paws and egg on her face. It would all be settled in the final challenge. As the final challenge lay before them, Louise steeled herself for the worst. She knew that Ambrosia would be on high alert after the results of the first 2 events. If she wanted to win the third, no amount of trickery would suffice. It had to be pure skill that bested the cat. That was why she picked the event that she was best at, even though it happened to be her competitor's best event as well. The plates had been scattered around them, some still warm from the microwave, others still cold from the fridge. The 2 would compete in a game of Uncle. The first to stop eating would lose. Ambrosia couldn't have been more confident or amped up, though Louise wasn't ready to roll over either. The feasting went on for nearly an hour, dirty plates being licked clean and flung around. Louise had to dive off quite a few plates to avoid getting lapped up herself. As the one with the bigger mouth, Ambrosia had the clear advantage when it came to sucking up more at once. But even with that advantage, Louise was matching her pound for pound. The mouse was surrounded by an ocean of foods she had never experienced before. Each new taste sent her on a 1,000-year journey through a dreamlike landscape, and it was doing wonders for her metabolism. As the 2 bellies began to fill, crumbs started to be left behind, and as they reached the 14th wave, Ambrosia looked to be breaking into a sweat. A belly that once had no limits was now finding those limits being tested. Meanwhile, Louise's belly was filled with a fire that could not be snuffed out. The question of hungry or full no longer mattered to her. Her nose that had been eternally kept on a leash was finally free to sniff to its nostrils' content. Ambrosia tried to keep shoveling down more food, but the look on her face suggested it would soon be coming back up. Her stomach gurgled as if crying out to stop the madness, but she refused to listen. Even as her chin dropped to the floor, even as her eyes sagged and her ears drooped, even as her own tongue flopped out of her mouth in surrender, she wouldn't admit defeat to the little mouse. Once she passed a plate of fish after taking only a single bite, it was clear she was finished. All she needed was one more handful of spaghetti for her pride to get the message. Ambrosia was stuffed. Morgan watched the whole thing from afar, and with the two competitors looking a little bloated, she elected to take care of the scoreboard for them. It took a good 5 minutes after Ambrosia's surrender for Louise to realise she had won. There were still so many other delicious foods to try, and she only had one mouth to eat them with. Once it was over, she felt a little disappointed that she didn't get to taste everything. She kind of hoped Ambrosia would ask for a rematch. With a protruding gut and a shiny gold medal around her neck, Louise strolled into the kitchen with her head held high. Victory was hers, which meant it was time to claim her reward. With her nose quelled for the moment, she felt confident that she could resist her greed, and she didn't want to be greedy anyway. She would insist on only taking a few items from the fridge, enough to make a delicious dinner. She couldn't wait to show her family the spoils that awaited them. If it was anything like the food she had just eaten, she was a little nervous that they would find it too overwhelming. She wondered how they would react. How Morgan would react. Would this earn Louise back her scavenging privileges? Would Morgan chastise and punish Louise even further for her recklessness? And what would her father say if he could see her now? She had dishonoured the Thrushwood way, but made it through the brambles and to a new promised land. Surely he would be proud of that, right? Lastly, Louise wondered how Ambrosia would react. After the cat had recovered from her loss, she had mostly been silent, her smug aura completely absent for once. Perhaps experiencing such loss had humbled her and taught her that size wasn't everything. Perhaps Louise had earned her respect with her performance, and they could now become close friends. Ambrosia and Louise did have similar taste in food. Perhaps they could share recipes. Louise would be more than happy to brush her fur and play with her in exchange. But before any of that, it was time for the cat to hold up her end of the bargain. Louise waited in anticipation for the silver medal kitty to open the fridge, and Morgan waited from the shadows with a smile that could light up the dark. Louise squirmed with all her might, but she couldn't move a millimetre. She couldn't even tip over the cone with her legs stuffed so firmly underneath her. Earlier, she had been wedged tight into a salt shaker and just barely unable to wiggle out. But now, she couldn't squeeze her way out of an ice cream cone if her life depended on it. It was difficult to feel betrayed when she felt so embarrassed. She tried squirming once more just in case, but it was no use. After the results of the eating contest, no amount of squirming or sucking in was going to pull her free. How had her luck taken such a dire turn? Now she knew how Ambrosia had felt in that tube. Or perhaps in general. Ambrosia returned to the room carrying a yellow putter. Not content to just stuff her mouse friend into an ice cream cone and laugh, she smirked as she put her master plan into action. Louise wasn't certain what it was until Ambrosia opened the window and flipped up Louise's cape, exposing the mouse's hindquarters. Then it was all clear. It really wasn't a roundabout means of opening the fridge for her. It was banishment. The cat couldn't deal with her loss and wanted to get rid of the evidence. In this case, that was her. Though Louise was in full panic mode at the prospect of being booted from the house, even she wasn't as terrified as the trembling mouse hiding up on the kitchen counter. It was too horrible for Morgan to watch, but she couldn't think of anything she could do. Pictures of her original cat encounter flashed through her mind as she weighed her options, all hope being eclipsed by the image of the cat's inner mouth. Were she to reveal herself in any way, she would just get captured. Eaten at worst, stuffed into her own cone at best. And were she to try to act without revealing herself, a cat that gluttonous would no doubt smell a rat. No option she could think of allowed both mice to escape unscathed, and no option where she did anything resulted in a better outcome than if she didn't. All she could do was watch and wait. Wait for the inevitable spanking that would seal her reckless mother's fate. Louise's father had once told her a story of mice using birds as transportation. Since mice couldn't fly themselves, they could instead use their skills to scrounge up worms and seeds as airfare. Louise never did get a chance to rent a bird herself, but she had always been a little curious as to what it was like. As it turned out, flying was terrifying. It was even worse than being stuck in the wind machine. Unlike in that circumstance, she felt as if there was nothing guiding her way, nothing ready to catch her as she inevitably fell. Everything was out of her control, and all she could do was accept it and soar skyward. She wondered what would become of her family. Would they ever find out what happened to her? Would Ambrosia pick them off one by one and make them share Louise's fate? Even little Sophia? Would Morgan catch one glimpse of Ambrosia and leave the house forever, returning to an unfamiliar wilderness? Would they be okay? Louise had no answer to these questions, but she did have one answer. No matter how far she flew from the house, she would stop at nothing to return. She would stop at nothing to see her family again. Ambrosia snidely waved off Louise's flight, donning her best hat and waving a handkerchief as if to suggest how much she would miss Louise. In reality, the cat felt nothing but joy as she watched her defeat sail out the window and out of her life. With the mouse sent packing, her honour as a cat had been restored, and her perfect record of defeating every mouse she went up against was preserved. Whether or not she went back on her word was irrelevant, as what good was a cat's word to a mouse anyway? Closing the window, Ambrosia felt fit for a celebration. But first things had to come first. There was still one loose end left to tie up. For at least one moment, Morgan had glimpsed at the forbidden fruit her mother had discovered and considered it possible to nibble on herself. But having seen that possibility jettisoned out the window, she clung back to the original Thrushwood way like a childhood teddy bear and rushed home. Her grandfather was right all along. There was no benefit from taking risks. All that mattered was doing just enough to survive until the next day. What she didn't realize that it was already too late to return to the no-risk life. Lacking her mother's experience with Ambrosia, Morgan had no clue just how watchful the cat's eyes were. Morgan's escape route was cut off by the cat's paw. Upon being caught, Morgan immediately subjugated herself, begging and pleading for her life while throwing out promise after promise that she wouldn't cause any trouble. Her wailing was loud enough to draw the attention of Adam and Abby, who were getting hungry and growing curious how their sister was faring as the new family scavenger. They took one look at her bowing before 20 pounds of raw cat blubber and got the sense that breakfast would be a little delayed that morning. The blubber grinned menacingly, revealing the size of its pointy teeth. After having so much fun with the first mouse, she was hungry for more. And seeing the red-caped mouse put on an even more pitiful display than the green-caped one, it was clear that fun was exactly what she'd get. Wrapping her tail around the red-caped mouse, she motioned with her paw to invite the two watching from behind the wall to come play too. No longer content with a mere game, Ambrosia wanted a full-fledged party. Donning the attire befitting of her status, Queen Ambrosia lounged back in her favourite spot beside the kitchen window. It was the warmest spot in the whole house, mainly because it was on top of the stove. Ambrosia loved to turn the stove on medium-high so she could warm her head and bottom at the same time. It was much less work than having to flip over every few minutes. And it was even more relaxing now that she had her jesters to cater to her every whim. It had been a good 15 minutes since her eating competition, and she was starting to get a bit peckish. With a pair of dainty claps, she sent 2 of her servants to fetch her an apple pie, while she scarfed down some bonbons as a pre-pie snack and had her 3rd jester fan her. She wasn't concerned with them sneaking a nibble of her food. She could tell they were far too intimidated of her to attempt such nonsense, as Red Cape had no doubt shared the fate of old Green Cape with the other 2. Ambrosia felt on top of the world. Though as luxurious as her throne was, she couldn't help but feel there was a tiny speck of dirt on it that she just couldn't wipe clean. The images of her losing the mouse's 3 challenges still plagued her mind. She couldn't fathom how she managed to lose all 3 challenges, or how a simple mouse had beaten her almost effortlessly. The first 2 were whatever, as the mouse had used dirty tricks. But losing the eating competition was unforgivable. It besmirched her honour as a cat. It was her job to be feared by mice, to have absolute authority over them, and most certainly have a bigger appetite than them. If a mouse could so easily overcome her, she may as well be a mouse herself. She had thought banishing Green Cape would restore her honour, but the shame continued to linger. Part of her wanted the little vermin to come back. She wanted a chance to redeem herself for real. She wanted to face the mouse again and win this time, if she got the chance. This time there would be no playing around, and certainly no falling for any more stupid tricks. As if to answer her pleas, a rumble in the bushes outside gave way to a familiar face. It didn't make much noise, but such an occurrence would never escape Ambrosia's watchful eyes. She smirked with glee just before the scent of her pie reached her nose. It seemed it was the Queen's playtime once more. Louise had served as the family scavenger long before her family moved into House Ambrosia. In addition to the barn and the hollow log, Louise had once lived a nomadic life in an untamed forest, minimizing risk by never settling down in one place. In order to stay on the move, she and her father would regularly need to scavenge materials to make a boat so they could cross the forest's main river. The waters could get intense, but with her father's help they always managed to reach the other side, sometimes with 1 or 2 kids in her arms. Given that experience, one would think crossing a mere swimming pool by herself would be much simpler. Originally, she'd planned to simply walk around it, but that plan turned belly up as soon as her favourite kitty squeezed through the backyard cat flap. With Ambrosia on the other side, looking ready to pounce at a moment's notice, it seemed that crossing the pool by boat would be the safest bet after all. Given Louise's experience with cats, she was fairly certain Ambrosia wouldn't be willingly taking a dip to swim after her. After scavenging a small inner tube and a stick to use as a makeshift boat and paddle, Louise began the long journey across. She saw Ambrosia getting comfortable over on the other side, dressed in what appeared to be a 2-piece bikini and setting up some yummy-looking refreshments. However, she figured that could be to her advantage. If Ambrosia got comfy enough, it was possible she would fall asleep, allowing Louise to pass without a fight. Little did Louise realize just what Ambrosia was getting comfy to do. That being said, Louise soon felt overjoyed that she hadn't challenged Ambrosia to a game of darts as one of her 3 events. Of all Ambrosia's faults, her aim was not one of them. This cat was crazy accurate. With a single throw, Ambrosia's dart punctured Louise's boat and sank it instantly, leaving Louise no choice but to swim back to shore. Not wanting to give Ambrosia the chance to move in for a finishing blow, she swam all the way back to the other side, as far away from the cat as possible. Ambrosia chortled from the comfort of her pool chair, taking a sip of her chocolate-infused juice and munching her chocolate-coated hot dog. Now soaking wet, Louise retreated into the bushes to think. Regardless of how comfy Ambrosia looked, it was clear there was little chance of her falling asleep, and Louise couldn't possibly scavenge enough boats to exhaust her darts. Moreover, it would be difficult to make it to the house even if she did manage to cross the pool. Ambrosia could just wait on the edge and scoop her up as she approached. There had to be a way across that would give her a clear shot to the back door, and Louise would give up anything to find it, even the nose on her face. Ambrosia was grinning from ear to fluffy ear, having successfully repelled Green Cape without breaking a sweat. She could feel the weight of her shame beginning to lift. All she needed to do was stop a few more of the mouse's futile attempts, and her reputation as a cat would be restored. She wondered what the mouse would be planning next as she kept her eyes locked on the bush it retreated into. Before long, Green Cape returned to the pool with a new plan and a new boat. Despite its size, it managed to lug an entire half of a mattress from the bushes and plop it into the pool. It was an impressive display of strength, but Ambrosia could only smirk at such a pointless endeavour. It was no use trying to use a boat that Ambrosia couldn't pop with her darts. Even if it did manage to row across, Ambrosia could just snatch it up once it reached the other side and send it flying again. No big deal. Ambrosia kept watching with curiosity, as the mouse hadn't yet boarded the boat. It seemed to still be assembling something to place on it. Ambrosia hoped it was a weapon. She loved it when mice thought they could construct something to overpower her. However, as it turned out, it was something far more interesting. The mouse presented a plate of pancakes that looked like something ripped from the pages of a catalogue. They were perfectly stacked and topped with a variety of berries. Ambrosia had no idea where the mouse obtained such a scrumptious treat, but she could smell a trap a mile away. The mouse was clearly trying to lure her to the other side, where it likely had a snare or something in wait. Ambrosia wouldn't fall for such an obvious ploy, no matter how delicious the pancakes looked. Then, as if Green Cape could sense Ambrosia's hesitation, the mouse presented one final ingredient to drizzle down the flapjacks. Barbecue sauce. Ambrosia could feel the sweat falling down her face, while her tongue wiggled through her lips as if arising to feed. She couldn't believe Green Cape was capable of such devilry. This mouse was after her own heart. Ambrosia got up from her chair and took a casual stroll over to Green Cape's new makeshift boat. She could still see the mouse hiding behind the tree and could tell it was in no position to make a run for it. She took a closer look at the pancakes, then took a big whiff. They smelled just as good as they looked. The berries and barbecue sauce swirled together into a beautiful blend that sent Ambrosia's eyes spinning. Surely one little bite couldn't hurt. Louise internally fist-pumped as Ambrosia positioned herself onto the mattress to taste her creation. It seemed the two were cut from the same cloth after all. Louise knew Ambrosia would go gaga once the barbecue sauce made its appearance. Those were just the kind of taste buds Ambrosia had. Of course, Louise had them too, and it had taken every ounce of willpower and the prospect of returning home to her family just to keep her tongue off the berries she scavenged. She watched with envy as Ambrosia plucked the big strawberry off the top pancake and popped it into her mouth. Louise didn't have much time to endure the sight, however, as her trap had just sprung into action. With Ambrosia firmly lounging atop the mattress, Louise pulled out her new oar and dashed over to the boat. As she had hoped, Ambrosia was too enthralled with the pancakes to notice her, the only situation where Ambrosia's watchful eyes lost their omniscience. Louise was surprised Ambrosia hadn't noticed anything suspect about her snack, but she wasn't about to complain. She had been counting on Ambrosia's bizarre taste buds to get her this far, and it was time to seize the moment. With Ambrosia fully occupied, Louise climbed up onto her back and plunged the oar into the chlorinated sea with as much gusto as she could manage. With one hearty shove, the SS Ambrosia set sail, just as the big cat was finishing off the last flapjack. It was around this time that Ambrosia had caught wind of how airy the pancakes tasted, now that the berries and sauce were no longer around to mask the flavour. With the last one still hanging from her mouth, she recognised she had been tricked into eating well-decorated, deflated pool toys. Unfortunately for her, the mattress was already out on the pool, with water on all sides. Were she to so much as wiggle her behind to shake off green cape, she would risk soaking her nice fur coat. Ambrosia dug her claws into the mattress and held perfectly still while Louise rowed the two of them to the other side. It was the outcome Louise had hoped for, but she was still impressed. Who would have thought ill-mannered Ambrosia had it in her to be a perfect little angel when the situation called for it? Louise wondered if there was a way to get her like this all the time. Though Louise had managed to completely pull the wool over Ambrosia's eyes once more, the cat still held all the cards. Once the two disembarked the mattress, Louise was completely at Ambrosia's mercy again. With both of them back on dry land, Ambrosia could punt Louise like a football right into the stratosphere. Louise's only hope was that the experience had made Ambrosia so fearful of the water that she felt compelled to get as far away from it as possible. Lucky for her, the cat was feeling awfully scaredy that afternoon. Ambrosia was completely done with the pool, wanting nothing more to do with guarding it or even standing near it. She scrambled to the back door of the house, deciding to set up a blockade right at her castle gate. Planting herself right in front of the cat flap and steeling herself for the worst, she was adamant that old Green Cape wasn't setting one foot back inside. Her pride as a cat depended on it. Louise knew it would come to this. Getting past Ambrosia here was her only chance of getting back inside. If she tried to find another entrance, she knew Ambrosia would just follow her and block it too. The cat had so much energy that Louise didn't think she could count on waiting until she fell asleep either. No matter how comfy she looked, the cat always seemed to have one eye open. As with the eating competition, this time there could be no tricks. The only way through was brute force. Armed with only a stick, Louise readied herself for a fight. She didn't want to hurt Ambrosia, and truthfully she didn't know if she was capable. She figured her best hope was trying to get a good shot at Ambrosia's backside to deliver a decisive poke to the cat's rear, sending her running away in shock. Louise could only hope Ambrosia and her old barn cat friend shared that trait as well. Despite Louise's limited knowledge of cats, one thing she knew was that they were very heavy. Even though they could contort their bodies to squeeze into narrow spaces, they were impossibly difficult to lift. Ambrosia, being such a big girl, was sure to be the heaviest cat Louise had ever met. That's why Louise was surprised to find her suddenly become lighter than air. It was a phenomenon Louise had encountered once before, and the look on Ambrosia's face gave it away immediately. Louise knew what this meant. She smelled a pie on the windowsill. Checking to her left and right, Louise spotted the pie in question. The window was indeed open, allowing for the pie to release its smell on an unsuspecting public. Ambrosia, having succumbed to its visible aroma, fell completely under its trance, the smell gingerly extracting Louise from her mind to replace it with thoughts of ice cream and whipped topping. Soon enough, the smell reached Louise's nose too. Even if it wasn't still piping hot, It was still a freshly baked apple pie. Such a smell could pull a fish from the water. The stick fell from her paws as she could feel her own feet beginning to rise from the ground. But just before completely giving herself away to the pie's magic spell, she threw her paws around her nose and planted her feet back on earth. She wouldn't let a delicious smell spell her doom. Not this time. No matter how delicious it was, this time only Ambrosia would succumb to the whims of her tongue, and Louise would be ready to capitalize on it. The mouse's nose still plugged, tears in her eyes as she denied the pie odor's vicious attempts to force its way in. Louise watched as the cat rose higher and higher until her hefty posterior was no longer blocking the door. Putting all hope into Ambrosia staying entranced, Louise darted towards the cat flap, passing through the blockade to return home. With Ambrosia's last line of defense up in smoke, Louise had finally succeeded in returning home. Having successfully made it back inside, Louise couldn't get but a few meters from the door before her legs started begging for mercy. While her old body couldn't run as fast as it used to, she still had a fair amount of stamina. However, the extra 2 or 3 pounds she had packed on from her previous splurging drained it away real quick. She could no longer run for long distances and fell into a puddle of her own sweat before even getting halfway across the kitchen. She kicked herself for letting her tongue go nuts. Why hadn't she restrained it more? She felt like a stuffed garbage bag. Heavy, smelly, and useless. How did Ambrosia carry such a gut around all the time? If Louise were a cat of her stature, she'd have been sleeping 20 hours a day. As if on cue, Ambrosia barreled through the cat flap in hot pursuit, face covered in hot apple filling. The cat's muscles were all supercharged with sugar, ready to catch 100 mice if need be. Louise wanted to run, but she didn't have the energy left to make her brain work. She couldn't even spare the mental resources to think what Ambrosia would do to her. Eat her? Kick her back out? Make her do the can-can? It didn't really matter. She couldn't outrun a cat in her state. All she had left were her memories. Memories of her life, her family, and all the tasty meals. Unlike when she was in the sandwich, this time she chose to let her final thoughts be happy ones. She didn't have the energy to despair either. She had succeeded in making it home and could at least feel good about her achievement. She was prepared to let the housemaster do as she may. Louise had put up a good fight against Ambrosia, but this time she was truly out of options. Since she'd returned to the house once, it was unlikely Ambrosia would choose to risk another banishment. This time she was dinner for sure. Or, since it was Ambrosia, a light pre-meal snack at least. The last thing she expected was for her uptight, cat-phobic daughter to butt in on her moment, dashing in between the two with a single cherry in her paws. As it turned out, Ambrosia didn't expect it either. Louise's serenity collapsed in on itself the second she realized what was happening. What was that crazy girl doing? Why was she outside the mouse hole? Why was she holding the Thrushwood family sword? Louise averted her gaze to Ambrosia, and much to her horror, she found the cat had its eyes on a new target. She couldn't let this happen. Above all else, she had to protect her daughter. Finding her feet again, Louise rushed up to Ambrosia's face, grabbing her whisker to pull those watchful eyes away from anything red. She put on a false act of bravado, throwing out a number of weight-based insults and likening Ambrosia to a number of different barnyard animals. She tried insisting that Ambrosia was just an overstuffed kitten that hadn't yet been weaned. She claimed Ambrosia needed to stuff herself into a mouse hole somewhere before a real cat showed up. All of it went in one ear and out the other. Nothing could pull the cat's eyes away from her new target. Morgan was holding food. Ambrosia's food. Louise wiped her glasses to make sure they weren't playing tricks on her. She knew Ambrosia loved her food, but she never could have guessed the cat had such a one-track mind. Louise thought that a little ego jabbing would make Morgan a shadow in the cat's mind, but that couldn't have been further from the truth, as Ambrosia got her food-obsessed rear in gear for a good old-fashioned mouse chase. Morgan led Ambrosia throughout the living room as if dragging her by a string. Onto dressers, over tables, across the couch, and onto the curtains. Morgan skillfully dodged each of the cat's advances, waving the cherry she had skewered with her sword to keep the cat's attention. By the time Ambrosia was on the curtains, Morgan was already halfway across the living room's glowing box. With each miss, Ambrosia grew more agitated and more klutzy as a result. Louise could tell just how used Ambrosia was to things going her way. Louise clambered onto a clawed dresser for a better vantage point. The fear for her daughter's safety began to wane as she came to realize Ambrosia was still 1,000 years too young to catch a mother of 5 rambunctious children. Pitting that kind of energy against a mere cat was almost unfair. However, what perplexed Louise wasn't Morgan's agility, but her courage. She couldn't shake the image of that scared little girl cowering under her covers all those years ago. To go from that to serving as live bait to a mad tigress seemed so improbable. It seemed more like something Adam would do. Or Davy. Not Morgan. What had possibly inspired her to carry out such a crazy stunt? Finding no answer and seeing nothing she could really do, Louise decided to kick back and watch the show. Poor Ambrosia. She may as well have been chasing the laser pointer again. While Ambrosia was neither fast nor agile, one thing Louise couldn't fault her for was her persistence. That cat didn't know when to quit. Even though her chances of catching Morgan were slim, she looked to be attempting to win a war of attrition, exhausting Morgan until she was easier to catch than a stuffed toy. Fortunately for the Thrushwood family, Morgan had prepared for this strategy. With a wide lead on the cat, Morgan tagged out, ducking behind a corner to sub in Ambrosia's second jester Abigail, who emerged from the corner carrying a blueberry. As the mice expected, Ambrosia saw the new food and instantly had a new target. With less speed but just as much agility as her sister, Abigail led Ambrosia into another new room Louise had never seen. As Louise peeked her head in to see how her younger daughter was faring, she noticed that Abigail had intentionally led Ambrosia right in front of a bicycle. And the cat was getting on. Louise gasped. If this cat knew how to ride a bicycle, Abby was toast. Louise darted inside quickly to intervene. Perhaps she could pop one of the tires with her teeth before Ambrosia could get her momentum going. These thoughts were derailed as her eldest daughter gave her tail a little tug, stopping her cold. She angled Louise's head towards the floor, and Louise began to understand. This bicycle was stationary. It lacked the means to move. Regardless, the cat put the pedal to the metal as she gave chase, and Abby ran in front of her. The bike couldn't move a millimeter, yet clever little Abby was still running in place in front of it, creating the illusion of a chase. Louise had to suppress her laughter at the sight. While it was funny to see Ambrosia working up a sweat for what could have been the first time in her life, it was funnier knowing she thought all that peddling was getting her somewhere. Morgan herself was too winded to speak, but as she caught her breath, she got to experience a little mother-daughter bonding. While hiding behind one dumbbell, the two got to watch another. The Thrushwoods knew it was only a matter of time before Ambrosia caught on to their trick. That's why they decided to stay one step ahead of her. While Ambrosia was burning through her sugar rush on the stationary bike, her third jester made his way onto her back and settled in right behind her neck. All it took was a simple "Yah!" and Ambrosia's new career as a bucking bronco was set into motion. With Ambrosia's energy depleted from all the chasing and pedaling, Adam was remarkably difficult for her to throw off. The more she tried, the more tired she became, and the more easily Adam could hold on. He led her into yet another room, and Louise had enough experience with toilets to piece together which room it was. While her son kept the cat busy, Louise managed to have a little chat with her eldest daughter about what was going on. It turned out that Morgan was the one that had opened the window to distract Ambrosia with the pie. It was part of their big plan to take Ambrosia down. Louise asked her daughter what possibly drove her to such lunacy, and Morgan pointed right at her mother's face. Morgan had seen everything. The competition, the banishment, the trip across the pool. It was all so inspiring to her. Louise had shown her just how outdated the old Thrushwood way of living was. She had blazed a path towards a new Thrushwood way, a dangerous way, but one they could follow if they worked together as a family. And the first rule, all naughty cats were to be put in their place. Morgan offered her mother the family sword and asked if she was interested to serve Ambrosia some humble pie. Louise smiled and took the sword in agreement. Poor Ambrosia was becoming skin and bones with all this exercise. She could use a slice or two. With Louise fully on board, Operation Lion Tamer was a go. As Adam kept Ambrosia occupied, the other 3 family members moved into a different room to set up their trap. Once it was ready, they baited Ambrosia into the room using a few of the small fruits Morgan had collected from the pantry back when Ambrosia was playing gatekeeper by the pool. Adam dismounted the cat and disappeared from view while her focus was on the fruit. Then, the game was on. The Thrushwoods had scattered a wide assortment of empty cans they had scavenged from the kitchen garbage can. With each mouse holding a fruit, they would lure Ambrosia near them and then disappear inside one of the cans. As one would slip out of view, a new mouse would take their place with a new fruit. Thanks to Ambrosia's short-sightedness, she would immediately change targets and focus on them, and the cycle would repeat. The mice endlessly disappeared and reappeared with their fruits, drawing in the cat's attention. And Ambrosia couldn't help but fall for it every single time. With her stamina already drained from the family's previous tricks, it didn't take long before Ambrosia's legs turned wobbly. Sweat was dripping down her face and off her tongue. She would have been hard-pressed to catch a piece of cheese if it was a few steps away from her. With Ambrosia in this state, the Thrushwoods decided to up the pressure. The family moved the cans closer, such that many were in Ambrosia's line of sight at once. She was now faced with multiple targets running every which way, and her watchful eyes were catching them all, even if her paws couldn't. As her movements began to slow to nothing, she couldn't even muster the strength to react as Abigail started taking artistic liberties with her backside. Ambrosia had checked out. Their mission was a success. Louise cheered in celebration. Meanwhile, Morgan took a deep breath. She knew what it was time for, even though a big part of her was screaming not to do it. Louise could tell what Morgan was thinking and put her hand on Morgan's shoulder. They both knew it had to be done, and with a nod of approval from her mother, Morgan returned to the mouse hole to bring out her kids. While it would normally be unthinkable to bring her children within a country mile of Ambrosia, the cat in its current state was about as harmless as a bag of marshmallows. Moreover, Morgan wanted to be certain that her children would grow up without the crippling phobia Morgan had as a child. She wanted them to see Ambrosia as a big, lovable teddy bear, and if Ambrosia didn't fit the archetype, then they'd file away all the rough edges until only the cuddly plush centre remained. Handing Elizabeth a grape and setting her loose to play keep-away, Morgan put Sophia on her shoulders and formally introduced her to their new neighbour. Sophia grabbed the cat's big fluffy tail in excitement. She didn't really know what a cat was, but anything this fluffy was begging to have a ribbon placed on it. If only she had one that was big enough. With Ambrosia's legs wobbling like a rickety chair, it was only a matter of time before her butt hit the carpet. Her energy completely sapped, Ambrosia had basically become a doll. She couldn't move, she couldn't think, and she definitely couldn't catch any mice. The Thrushwoods could do whatever they wanted with her. That being said, she wasn't exactly of the right proportions to be booted out the window with a golf club, or even physically pushed out of the room. Once she got her energy back, they'd likely be in the same situation they were in before. It was clear something else needed to be done, and Morgan had an idea what that was. Taking Sophia and Elizabeth with her, she instructed Adam and Abigail to take the cat's measurements using the tape measure they scavenged while setting up their trap. While those two took the measurements, Louise stayed behind to supervise and make sure Ambrosia didn't come to her senses. It was hard to believe the cat posed such a major threat back when Louise was working alone. All it took was a little family assistance, and the situation went from begging the cat for mercy to figuring out what size underwear she wore. She watched as Ambrosia panted, her long tongue that was once exclusively used to facilitate her eating regiment, now dangling uselessly from her mouth like a sleeping snake. Louise smiled as she watched the sight, but she wasn't feeling a sense of schadenfreude as she might have thought. After all the trials and tribulations the two had gone through that day, Louise had started to grow attached to the big kitty, in the same way she grew attached to her old barn cat friend. Ambrosia was starting to feel like a member of the Thrushwood family, and seeing her sit down and behave like a good girl filled Louise with something she could only call parental pride. Perhaps all Ambrosia needed to change her ways was a strong motherly role model. Louise would have to talk to Morgan about a rehabilitation program once the cat was properly dealt with. Abigail looked shocked as she read the numbers on the tape measure, though Louise couldn't figure out if it was because they were too high or too low. Either way, they raced off to report their results to Morgan. Ambrosia could no longer deny it. She was tired. If she couldn't find a source of energy soon, the mice would get away with her food scot-free. She was currently in the Home Office, and she had already emptied the mini-fridge she kept stashed in there earlier. But the kitchen was still only one room away. All she had to do was get back to it, and she'd have all the food she needed. However, her legs were so weak it would be a stretch to say that she could make it that far. She could crawl for it, or perhaps squirm on her belly, but she didn't want to give the mice the satisfaction of seeing her reduced to such a state. If she took a nap, it would be just as effective as a seat at a buffet table. But that was the one thing she absolutely could not do. No cat worth its salt went to sleep when mice were on the loose. Her reputation would never recover. With her options limited, a miracle suddenly dropped in her lap. The faint aroma of milk drew her attention to a trio of mice that were unfamiliar to her. They were carrying with them her saucer of milk and dropped it a few steps away from her. At first she thought they were taunting her, but then she realized it was meant to be a gift. Ambrosia didn't like it. The idea of relying on mice to get her out of a jam sickened her. But perhaps she could rationalize it by claiming these mice as her new servants. Wholly different from the evil mice that wanted to steal her food. Then Ambrosia wouldn't have to worry about showing gratitude or owing them favours. Seeing no better choices available to her, she decided to accept their offer. It was time to refill her tank. Ambrosia only had one thing on her mind. She had to lap up that milk as fast as possible and get back in the game. The longer she was out of commission, the more food those mice would steal. She snatched the bowl off the ground and bathed her tongue in the sweet nectar, gulping it down as fast as she could. As the energy from the milk began to restore her senses, the tiniest squeak drew her attention to her feet. Another tiny mouse in a pink dress and a gloomy-looking one dressed similarly to the red-caped mouse were standing before her. In the pink one's paws was a striped straw. At first Ambrosia thought they wanted her milk and tried to pull it close to her face, but the pink mouse insisted it was a present, claiming that slurping the milk down in one gulp will only give the cat hiccups and an upset stomach. She proposed the cat make use of the straw to drink at a steady pace and still feel good afterwards. The gloomy one silently nodded in agreement. Ambrosia felt a little ashamed once again to be relying on mice to help her get back in fighting shape, but she once again rationalized it by asserting these two mice were her new servants. It was their duty to get Ambrosia back on her feet, and it was her duty to make them do their duty. With that thought stapled into her brain, she accepted the straw without so much as a nod of appreciation, shooing the mice away. Then she set the bowl down to enjoy her drink through her new utensil, feeling very satisfied with herself. It wasn't long after that a third wave of mice appeared with more to offer Ambrosia, though the cat was better acquainted with this lot. Wearing their hats from before, Ambrosia's 3 jesters returned with a blanket and a fresh glass of milk. They claimed they wished to offer their full loyalty to their queen once again. Ambrosia was naturally sceptical, so they began their appeal. Unfurling the blanket, they wrapped it around Ambrosia's backside and folded it underneath her until snug. To Ambrosia's surprise, it was a perfect fit, and was awfully comfy at that. She wasn't about to turn away a soft blanket during a meal, so she let it be. Then the mouse in the blue shirt started juggling for her. It was decently entertaining, so she let it be. Finally, the red-caped mouse refilled her milk bowl with the bottle. The new milk had a remarkable warmth to it that made it go down so much smoother. It started to make her eyes feel heavy, but the taste was too good to resist. So she let that be as well. She thought for a second the room was getting darker, but disregarded it as her level of comfort playing tricks with her eyes. As her mind began to take on a thick fog, she suddenly had a hard time remembering what she was doing or why she was drinking the milk, but she was too comfortable to care much. She decided to just enjoy the juggling performance and keep drinking. She was certain the answer would come back to her eventually. Louise watched from the kitchen, the apprehension plain as day on her face. Had they finally exhausted her enough that this could work? Was the blanket comfy enough? The milk warm enough? The lights dim enough? Louise watched those watchful eyes carefully as they got closer and closer to closing, hoping that for once Ambrosia would let them take a break. Back and forth, Ambrosia was rocked in her blanket. She hadn't even yet noticed that her paws had been tucked snugly inside, turning her into a fully loaded cat burrito. All that remained exposed was her face, and with the straw still in her mouth, she was unhindered to continue slurping up more of the delicious, warm milk. If the milk and rocking weren't enough, one of her 2 rockers began to sing a soft lullaby right into her ear, and at that point Ambrosia's eyes gave up the futile effort of staying open. After a few minutes more of rocking and singing, bubbles began to form in Ambrosia's milk bowl. That clinched it. If Ambrosia was blowing out of a straw that could be used to suck in more sustenance, there was no way she was still awake. Morgan lifted the cat's heavy eyelid. Much like the cat's goofily satisfied grin, the eye said it all. Ambrosia was on vacation in dreamland, and the Thrushwoods were the furthest thing from her mind. Douglas gave the signal to his grandmother that the coast was clear. Louise beamed with delight. She was proud of the whole family for all the work they put in. She knew they could do it. And now it was time for the Thrushwoods to collect their just reward. The food from the fridge that Louise had won during her earlier competition. She and Ambrosia had never agreed upon an exact amount of food, but in an interest in forgiving Ambrosia, Louise decided to take a little more than originally planned and call them square, putting all the dirty deeds behind them. The kids were perhaps having a bit too much fun collecting the spoils, but Louise couldn't blame them. Were she not required to be the adult, she would have joined right in. The wagon was fully loaded and ready to go, but that in itself posed a problem. How were the Thrushwoods going to drag a food-stuffed wagon back to their mouse hole? They'd have better odds trying to roll Ambrosia down the hall. After all attempts at pushing the wagon proved fruitless, Morgan got another idea. She went back home to grab her mother's fishing rod, though when she came back, her plan got put on the back burner. As Morgan returned, she found her family treating Ambrosia's head as their own personal jungle gym. Deciding that it would be unwise to raise her voice, she gave her mother a stern look of disapproval. Louise giggled, setting down a wet floor sign beside the stream of drool pouring from Ambrosia's mouth. It was clear that the cat wouldn't be causing trouble in her current state, even if she did wake up. So why not let the kids have their fun? Morgan wanted to protest, but she did say earlier that she wanted the kids to overcome their fear of cats. With two of her triplets playing double dutch with the cat's whiskers, and her youngest daughter applying a green ribbon to the top of the cat's head, it seemed like fear was the last thing on any of their minds. Her layabout siblings were even taking photos of themselves, standing atop the beast they bested. However, Morgan had to draw the line at Elizabeth, who was sneaking a bite of chocolate from their haul. Morgan wasn't about to have her kids spoiling their dinner on such a special day. Morgan's plan was simple. All they had to do was dangle something delicious in front of Ambrosia's face, and Ambrosia would undoubtedly move towards it, asleep or no. Tying a turkey leg to her fishing rod, Morgan attempted to drag Ambrosia into a half-conscious state, but it didn't seem to be getting the job done. Ambrosia just kept snoring away. Knowing the cat pretty well, Louise asked to see Elizabeth's chocolate. With just a little bit of chocolate slathered on the turkey leg, Ambrosia's engine turned on. She inched forward like a worm, her limbs still contained within the blanket, and her tongue rolling along the floor to lap up the fatty drippings. Before she could squirm away, Louise cut open the back of Ambrosia's blanket with her sword to expose the cat's tail, fashioning the cut portion into a makeshift Thrushwood flag. Then they tied the wagon to Ambrosia's tail, turning the cat worm their own personal delivery service. She did such a good job with the first batch of groceries, there was enough time to make a second trip. Sophia was having fun just riding in the wagon, growing to like Ambrosia more and more. Elizabeth was rather salty, though. Her mother didn't seem to care about the cat spoiling its dinner. The Thrushwoods were just about done dropping off the last pieces of food into their mouse hole. It had taken a good 15 minutes, but thanks to Ambrosia they managed to get 3 wagons worth of food, enough to last a year or more if they were smart about it. All they had left was some candied celery and a single raspberry. Louise chose to handle the raspberry while the others took the celery. As they brought in the long green stalk, one of the candies got detached from the frosting as it bumped against the lip of the hole. Sophia was quick to notice. Her mother and grandmother had taught her the value of saving every scrap of food, and she wasn't about to let a piece of candy go to waste. She bounded up to catch the candy and bring it inside, dropping her plush toy in the process. Louise, still carrying the raspberry, spotted the fallen toy and paused. She couldn't just stand by and let Sophia's fallen toy go forgotten. Unfortunately for Louise, a certain four-legged foodie was rising from her milk-induced slumber, having finished off the chocolate turkey in her sleep. Her eyes opened to the sight of her candied celery disappearing into a hole that was too small for her to enter, along with a familiar green-caped mouse, once again holding a piece of her fruit. Her senses restored from a good long nap, Ambrosia was steamed hotter than a piece of broccoli. She absolutely wasn't letting her prey get away, but she needed to do something about the plush blankets suppressing her limbs. Too frustrated to simply unroll herself, she tore through the blanket with her claws, turning the cloth into a new fashion statement. She realized this new outfit covered up her intimidating fur markings, so she grabbed a nearby paintbrush and quickly remedied the issue. With a newly painted angry skull on her side, her paw came down in front of the mouse hole to block off the green-caped mouse's escape route. This time, none of the mouse's fancy tricks would save it. This mouse would be the one to pay the price for stealing her beloved food stash, and no tantalizing foodstuffs were going to distract her. Ambrosia was too hungry for vengeance to let that happen again. With Ambrosia's watchful eyes locked on the green-caped mouse, there was nowhere to hide. And with her fabulous self now being bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, there was no way to run either. All the mouse could manage was to pull a pitiful-looking toothpick from its side, as if that could do anything. Puffing up her fur as best she could despite the restriction of the blanket, Ambrosia released a mighty roar, baring her sharp fangs as well as she could. The mouse's reaction wasn't as spectacular as Ambrosia was hoping, but she could see the mouse's lips quivering under the pressure. It was only a matter of time before it cracked. All Ambrosia had to do was hold still and look scary until then. Louise could no longer hold in her laughter. Seeing the cat with chocolate smeared on its face and the bow in its hair was silly enough, but the wacky decal she had painted on her blanket was beginning to run, making for an even sillier display. It was like Louise was watching her two granddaughters wearing a big cat disguise, trying to look intimidating while being also unable to resist a cute accessory. Seeing the antics of her grandchildren on such a giant figure created a visual conflict that was just too comical. Louise had no choice but to laugh. She dropped her sword to the ground and held her stomach, trying her best not to fall over. It was impossible for her to feel endangered. After all, how could she be scared of her own grandchild staring her down? Ambrosia wasn't having any of it. There was no way she was finishing off a mouse while it was keeling over laughing at her. If she swallowed such shame, it would surely come rising back up later. As her tunnel vision faded, she realized what the mouse was laughing at. She licked her lips and tasted the chocolate on her cheeks, then noticed the paint running on the sack that encompassed her body. She had to do something about this. First, she tore open the front of the blanket to hide the paint and rose onto her hind legs to make herself look bigger. She even used the blanket to increase the enlargement effect. Then she dealt with the chocolate by grabbing a can of whipped cream from the kitchen and spraying her face with it. It covered up her messy face while also making her look crazy and rabid. With this setup, that green-caped mouse was sure to fear her. By the time Ambrosia returned, Louise's first laughing fit led straight into her second. She fell onto her back, rolling with laughter at the silly kitty wearing a blanket like a cape and sporting a whipped cream beard. It was just like her grandsons playing their make-believe game, and the little bit of whipped cream on Ambrosia's whisker ruined any illusion of her looking rapid. Louise just couldn't stop laughing. She had no idea Ambrosia was such a comedian. Ambrosia was turning red in more ways than one. She couldn't believe this mouse was still laughing at her. There had to be some explanation. She gave herself a once-over if there was anything else embarrassing she was missing, until finally spotting the bow on her head. She tugged at it with her paws, but it was tied far too tight for her to remove. She scowled, impatiently tapping her front toes. This called for drastic measures. Ambrosia grabbed the paintbrush and stormed off to prepare. This time she was pulling out all the stops. Standing up on her hind legs to look as big as possible, she drew a scary face on her belly and lit some candles to create some spooky atmosphere. She set the candles around herself and made a spooky face to match her belly face, while covering the little bow on her head with the blanket to maximize the scare factor. She made sure there was nothing left to laugh at. The mouse would surely turn pale with fear. Louise put up her paw to beg for mercy. She couldn't take any more of this hilarity. While Ambrosia was busy making herself look scary, she failed to notice that her tail was getting a little too warm. It wasn't until she started smelling the smoke that she finally realized what was happening. And as she ran away in terror, she finally managed to plant some fear in the green-caped mouse's heart. Ambrosia was far too panicked to even think about heading for the nearest source of water, and after her third lap around the living room, Louise could tell she needed help. It would take far too long to drag in a bucket of water, even with the entire family helping out. But as her eye caught on a shiny piece of metal, she realized that would be unnecessary. The air machine Ambrosia was playing with earlier was still in the living room. Louise snapped her fingers as if to say, Eureka! Fire needed air to survive. If she could remove all the air around Ambrosia's tail, it would snuff out the flame in an instant. And if she could put out that fire, it would put her in Ambrosia's good graces for sure. Maybe they could finally put all their bickering behind them. With no time to lose, Louise powered on the air machine and flipped it into reverse, pointing it right at Ambrosia's tail as the cat came around for lap 4. At first, Ambrosia felt a sense of relief as her burning backside suddenly cooled. It was short-lived, however, as the cat soon came to realize there was yet another creature in their house more gluttonous than she was. Ambrosia's gut held out for as long as it could against the vacuum's powerful suction. But eventually, the nature of her feline body gave out and took the shape of its container. By the time Louise shut off the machine, Ambrosia had become a half-cat, half-vacuum hybrid, her fluffy tail sticking out the back to complete the look. She was naturally riled up about her condition, and Louise found it a bit risky to let her out right away, but she promised to set Ambrosia free once the cat calmed down. Before that, Louise had something more important to tell her. Having seen Ambrosia's vulnerable side and realizing just how similar she was to her own family, Louise made her decision. She would adopt Ambrosia as an honorary Thrushwood, warts and all. She knew it would be difficult to integrate a cat into a family of mice, but she was confident they could work out their differences and develop a loving and happy relationship. Louise gave Ambrosia's vacuum tube an accepting hug to seal the deal. Ambrosia was grumpy beyond belief. First, she got sucked into a vacuum, and then a mouse wanted to be her mum. However, with her pride as a cat thoroughly stomped out from her prior embarrassments, she was begrudgingly forced to admit that she was not the mice's superior. And if that was the case, why not accept the offer? Without them being afraid of her, they were no fun as toys. And being a mouse couldn't have possibly been more humiliating than being the mouse's enemy. And so, though one party was much more eager than the other, a new familial bond was formed. While Ambrosia wasn't the sunniest flower in the field, she eventually was able to calm down enough for the Thrushwoods to free her from the vacuum. Once Ambrosia was out, She couldn't rightly start eating or banishing her family. She was stuck between a rock and a hard place. All she could do was accept her new lot in life, as the youngest child of an elder mouse. Louise was no fool when it came to raising kids. She was certain Ambrosia would have her moments of acting out and rebelling, but Louise was confident she and the rest of the family could keep her in line. Besides, the family owed Ambrosia a big favour for introducing them to the new Thrushwood way. A lifestyle without settling for table scraps, where one states what they want and pursues it. They owed it to her to teach her to become a model kitty. To kick off the teachings, Ambrosia would have to pay the consequences of her misbehaviour. Louise wanted to be a good mother after all, so as punishment, Ambrosia's desserts were greatly reduced in portion size for a whole week. The cat's grumpiness got her a great deal of teasing from her siblings, but luckily she was able to take it without embarrassing herself further. For being such a good sport, Louise promised her she was free to tease her siblings as much as she wanted, provided she didn't become a bully again. It was anyone's guess what the fate of the Thrushwoods would be after Ambrosia's adoption. Would Ambrosia stay tame and civil? Would the family stay happy and well fed? Would a new threat come to jeopardize them all? Only time would tell. All there was to do now for the Thrushwoods was revel in their victory. They had finally obtained the cuisine Louise had always dreamt of. Thanks for listening.